see, I think we are now live.
Yep, yeah.
Okay, we're live. Joined this hour by Libertad Ayala. We're very, very excited. She's an organizer, a unionist, just a badass freedom fighter. And so this is really, really exciting. Libertad, before we get started into some of the work that you're currently involved in, have been involved in, let's start at the beginning. So how did you get involved in the movement?
Well, I think it's a little bit different than most people's upbringings. But I was fortunate enough to be brought in by my parents, and really since birth. So for me, organizing and being part of the movement is very much second nature because it was a daily activity in our house. So when I think about getting involved, I mean, there's no starting point. It's like, it's been my family, it's been the people that I love, it's been how I've grown up. So I started because of my parents.
Yeah. So you're, for those who don't know, your parents, your father especially, was heavily involved in La Raza Unida. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization and the role he played in that?
Yeah, so the organization is El Partido Nacional Raza Unida, and initially it started as a third party to counter the Democratic and the Republican Party. However, in its development and in its history, we decided that the reality is that being a third party and thinking that reform or change is possible within a system is just contradictory. And so La Raza Unida started focusing on more of education and community organizing, because we felt that the only way to really liberate our people is through education, self-determination, and forms of revolution. And so I know that folks often think of revolution as a singular act of violence, but revolution means change, so it's through these acts of change that we actually empower our folks. And so La Raza Unida decided, more than 3 decades ago, that our work would not be to do electoral work, because at the rate that we had a backyard party, a tamalada, to raise funds for flyers and community outreach, capitalism would smash us immediately because they could outfund us, outnumber us, and creating alliances with neoliberals like the Democratic Party was never part of what we could do. It was against our ideals and against a lot of our own convictions to think that, receiving money from the Democratic Party or other neoliberal groups was actually gonna lead us towards some change.
Yeah.
So
So can you speak a little bit to how these kind of conclusions? I mean, can you expand a little bit about how these conclusions were came to, that maybe that the answer was not necessarily just getting on the ballot, but actually organizing the community?
well, I think that, we have like contemporary examples right now, as folks had in the 70s. We had an increase of our folks in institutions of higher learning. We had increase of our folks in electoral politics, and we saw that even though we had an increase of folks in city councils, electoral politics, school boards, that wasn't necessarily changing the conditions of our people. Because in order to challenge these conditions, you can't really work within that structure. You become another cog, in a mechanism that's built on oppression. So it's like thinking that you're going to make a blender a vacuum because you add, you add something different to the decoration on your blender cup. It's still a blender. It's still gonna, you know, it's still gonna blend and crush and do all these things. It's never gonna become a vacuum, And so I think that within that, within seeing those examples, right, that, sure, we had professors, but professors that then had to protect their tenure, right? And by protecting their tenure, it was making sure that they weren't challenging, And not that all professors did this, right? But the majority of, professors did this. They weren't challenging the status quo because they were trying to protect their tenure. We had counselors doing the same, principals doing the same, city council members doing the same, didn't want to rock the boat, right? And so this ideology comes from that. It's like, if there's a mechanism that's already built, and you want this mechanism to change its ways, you're not going to change it by changing the aesthetics of it. You have to change it by completely crushing it and rebuilding it. And that's really where a lot of our, thinking came about. And we see that, like, people thought that because you elected Barack Obama, and people are going to be upset about this, but that things were actually going to change for communities of color, and they didn't. And it's not that we have a dislike for Barack Obama because he's Black. We have a dislike for Barack Obama because he's a neoliberal, right? No different than Hillary. My dislike for her is not because she's a woman, right? It's because she's a neoliberal white woman, and so what's her role in politics and the change? I mean, the same applies for, Kamala Harris. And I can go on, Antonio Villaraigosa, right? Julian Castro. We can go with endless names, right, of folks. But the reality is that you can't change something that was built to do this one thing. And that's what, American politics is built on. It's built on perpetuating imperialism. It's built on perpetuating capitalism. It's built on perpetuating oppression. And you're not going to stop it, by changing its decoration.
Yeah. So before we get into some more of your current work, can you tell us about your early days, you yourself, when you began to organize? What were some, like, the campaigns, different things that you began work on when you were out there, organizing?
Well, like I said, I can't really differentiate, like, when I did it on my own, right? But I think that, like, organizing, on my own became more evident, I think, when I was in middle school. And so it was around organizing, some of my schoolmates and some of my peers. And it became a lot stronger during our high school years, especially during the North American Free Trade Agreement, because my community was directly impacted by the North American Free Trade Agreement. So, Pacoima is in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. It was highly reliant on manufacturing, and a lot of the folks in my community had good union jobs because they were part of these manufacturing plants, whether it was Sloan, Price Pfister, Boeing, Black & Decker, GM. And so in my youth, a lot of my work became focused on that. And like I said, it's really hard to differentiate because I always felt like that I was organizing and building those skills and practicing those skills. I think that the first time I spoke publicly, I was about 8 years old, and so it was just always part of, like, who I was.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to the Pacoima and how badly it was, or how badly, like much of the country was devastated by not just NAFTA, but like automation and the whole process in which, like, that factory work began to get, kind of stripped away? Like, how devastating was that on the community?
I mean, like, Pacoima itself was had the ability to provide to the community these single family homes, and middle class lifestyle for a lot of brown folks, Black and brown folks. And so a lot of, like, the tract housing in my neighborhood where I grew up, on my parents' block on 5th Street or Herrick, was actually tract housing built for middle class Black families. After the North American Free Trade Agreement, we see families that had to leave Pacoima to go out to even further out areas like Antelope Valley, Victorville, Palmdale, leaving the state, right? I had directly family members that had to move to Indiana to follow the work for the GM plants, and which really, broke up our families. And so not only myself as a person that was directly impacted by that, but a lot of the community members saw that their families had to move out of state out of necessity, and you broke up a community that for the most part wasn't as transient as other parts of greater Los Angeles, but that was very much, a tight-knit community, woven into the fabric of the San Fernando Valley. And you made it more transient than it had ever been, for the entirety of my life up to that point, up to 94, 95, I had known all my neighbors on the block. They're the same people that had lived there. They're the same people that had lived there amongst my father, and amongst my grandfather. I had family members that lived within a 2-block radius. And so, you talk about NAFTA and you just have people in devastating situations losing their homes, and I think it's really sad about, one of the stronger Black and Brown communities really being disrupted. And really, I think one of the goals in our community has been to be able to maintain the history of Pacoima, right? The history that's been lost and the community that has been lost. Because the longtime residents that had lived there for generations aren't there anymore. I mean, even with the current crisis right now, I can tell you that, one of my neighbors became homeless. And, to me, it's devastating to see someone that lived on my block for generations, whose father was able to provide his family a home because of his manufacturing work, lose their house because they borrowed against it to be able to provide medical care for their ailing father. And it's capitalism, right? It churns you out once it doesn't need you and you become expendable. And so I think that throughout our barrios we can see that, that constantly we become expendable, and that community that we were able to build before is constantly broken up because you have people coming in and out because they are not able to preserve the homes. And unfortunately, Pacoima is one of the targets for gentrification. They've moved it out of East LA, Highland Park, Atwater, and it's definitely one of the new targets.
Just as in like Boyle Heights, just as in the Mission area, I noticed that part of the gentrification process is an attack upon the murals. Like the biggest one of the first things they do is they attempt to whitewash the murals, and people don't really realize, but Pacoima has got like some of the biggest and longstanding murals in the whole Southern California area.
Yeah. So we have like the Mural Mile, which is on Van Nuys Boulevard, and all throughout the neighborhood, right? It's something that has, consistently been there. Like I remember painting murals with my father, at Pacoima Middle School, for the students. And it's a constant part of our community. And I think that, you're right, gentrification starts peering out in these small ways. I know that there is a Machete mural that was on Van Nuys Boulevard that had on the street sign, it said Pacoima. And one of the first things that recently happened is that it had to be blocked out. It couldn't say Pacoima anymore, right? So that pride for our community, is minimized to like gang affiliation when it's not. Like a lot of us have roots there, that expand generations. And even for those that don't have those roots, it doesn't make it any less of a community of color and a stronghold for culture.
So can you tell us a little about your educational journey? So after you're organized in high school, then later you go on. So can you tell us a little about the path you took?
Yeah, I'm a college dropout. So in my educational journey, I made a decision probably early on when I started seeing a lot of my peers accumulate college debt. And I decided that that wasn't what I was going to do, right? It wasn't something that I was going to do. And I think that for most folks, it comes to a surprise when I'm open about, this part of my history, but it's not anything that I'm really ashamed of. You know, I am the person that I am, whether I would have crossed that stage or whether or not. And I'm doing the same work that I would have done. You know, would have a degree changed the work that I would have done? Probably not. You know, my goal wasn't to become, you know, a corporate lawyer or anything else like that. That wasn't my path, you know. And as much as my mom wanted me to become a nurse or a doctor, I really cannot handle the sight of blood. Um, so, you know, to me, it's just I feel satisfied that who I am wouldn't have changed with that debt, because that's how I see it. It's a debt that I personally wasn't prepared to take on, you know.
So yeah. So that you've gone on the work that you're doing. You made mention that. So you've gone to be an organizer, a union organizer in
Mhm.
the city of Berkeley. So can you tell us a little about the work you do in Berkeley?
Yeah. So I started my career in organizing as my shop steward in my own shop at Los Angeles Unified School District. Um, and I've had this trajectory for like the last 20 years. I've been on this trajectory for the last 20 years. And currently I am an organizer. I'm a lead organizer, so I oversee labor relations in at UC Berkeley, Santa Cruz, and Merced. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what are some of the struggles going on right now with the within the UC system? I know there was like there was like call for a strike, or there was
Yeah, well,
there's
we've been on a contract fight for the last 3 years, and actually we went on strike 9 days in the last 3 years. Sometimes 1 day strikes, sometimes 3 day strikes. But again, the fight with UC is like any other fight with a corporation. They're trying to preserve their funding, they're trying to preserve their money, they're trying to preserve, you know, their lifestyle on the backs of people of color. And that's what we see a lot here in UC. You know, in the UC system, we've seen a decrease of Black workers, you know, over the years. So we've also seen, you know, that the lowest paid workers are Black and Brown women for the university. And the people that really make the university run and make the university successful are really, you know, lower paid workers of color. And so, again, that's going to be one of the fights that we're going to have with UC, because UC is no different than Walmart. It's no different than Amazon. And it is the largest employer in the state of California.
yeah. So this is kind of a the taking these interviews is kind of designed hopefully for a wide cross section of society. So not everybody's like involved so politically. Not everyone's entrenched so much. So there's a lot of people that they don't really know why. They know there's something unjust going on, but they're not exactly sure why. How do we account for these disparities? Like why are Black and Brown women paid so low? I mean, how would you as a kind of a revolutionary thinker, how would you explain the position of the people we have to organize?
Yeah, I think that folks are constantly asking, why do you always make it about race? Right. So folks that are a little bit more in the know, right, get asked this question constantly. And I think that we make it about race because that's how this system was built, right? So this system is built on disparities. For it to function for the top 1%, for it to function for the presidents and the CEOs of this country, right? Mostly, you know, white men, and sprinkled in some Jay-Z's, right? Some A-Rods, right? For it to function and have these folks with these large accumulations of wealth, it must function on these disparities. So it has to have these folks that are constantly lower paid so that, you know, the money is then funneled to these higher paid folks. So it has to be a constant like that, because that's the way it was built. It was built on being able to exploit Black and Brown bodies over and over and over. And, you know, folks think that, you know, well, you know, now we have Black and Brown millionaires, we must have made it. But those are such a small amount of our population, right? That it doesn't account for the greater part of our population that is either being detained, incarcerated, exploited, murdered by police in La Mira on a daily basis. So I think that for folks that are still, wondering or still in their search for information, knowledge on this path, I think that one of the things is that how this country was constructed, and it was constructed on racism. So racism is going to perpetuate racism in every form of its work, whether it's education, right? And that's why as brown folks, we have one of the highest dropout rates, incarceration. That's why, we account for some of the highest population of incarcerated folks in this country, whether it's, police interactions. And, unfortunately, we can see that, this week, where you can have white men with armed, AK-47s, assault rifles, storm the police, storm, city buildings, state buildings with arms, and you have a person telling them, that they can't breathe, that they can't actually breathe, and their interactions are vastly different. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that, this country was built on these disparities. And so it's not going to ever change, no matter how many folks we have that become millionaires, no matter how many folks we have in office, it's not going to change because it's built on these disparities. So what has to happen is that there has to be this deep, deep revolution of consciousness of the people, right? And I mean, we can talk about it as it references to the elections. Folks feel like that we always have, these choices, and really it's not. We don't have these choices in electoral politics in this country, and people like yourself and I are shamed into not wanting to vote like folks for Biden, right? Because we have to practice, these forms of democracy, but they're not. They're all parts of, the show. It's all part of like wagging the dog. There's no real change in this country, no matter who you vote for, because it's not a popular vote. It's not true democracy. And the folks that are being prompted and pushed up are not folks that actually represent the majority of the folks in this country, which are Black, brown folks, working class folks that are struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah. I think people forget. I mean, just like what the actual I mean, people see Trump and they hear his rhetoric, but I think they forget like what the actual policies of the Obama Biden years really were. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
Trump's an extension of that. Can you speak a little bit to just like how bad? I mean, like just what are some of the crimes of some of the more recent Democratic administrations that people should be aware of? Um, I mean, people are aware of
Well,
Trump, aware of Bush, they're aware of how bad they were, but people are not quite don't seem to be as aware of Clinton and Obama.
and I think that like where you're saying, it's I wouldn't say necessarily that folks aren't aware, right? But we're taught, right, that the Democratic Party somehow is the party of the people, right? So we're taught that, oh, we could overlook that because, you know, things weren't that horrible under Obama, or Obama was an eloquent speaker and didn't speak like Trump. And so, why are we making the case that Obama is no different than Trump? Well, we're making that case because Obama did mass deportations, right? Obama, and I think this is going to be controversial for some folks, but also created DACA, right? And whether this is not against anyone receiving DACA, but it created this system where we only value the folks that are receiving an education, right? We're not valuing the folks that came to this country, right, as children, and who are also contributing to this system, but who are not having the privilege of, enrolling in these institutions of higher learning, and only value the folks that actually, in the eyes of this society, are going to contribute, right, and contribute to them means that they're going to actually, bring in money to this country or make money for this country, not the folks that are, working the factory jobs, that are working, in the dining halls, the folks that are actually the essential workers that have been highlighted by this whole pandemic, and I think that that's really something that we have to see, right? That we are all valuable, and it's not just because of the labor that we bring, or not because of the resources that our labor brings, but we're valuable because we're human beings, and all our folks on this continent deserve to be here, deserve to be here without any persecution, deserve to be here. And Obama was one of the spearheads that was able to say, no, the only valuable ones are the ones that are getting an education. Those are the folks, you know, that deserve, to be here. And as you can see with this pandemic, we have a lot of folks that are here that make sure that we are being fed, that make sure that we're safe. And I think that's one of the things. I think with Bill Clinton, definitely it was the North American Free Trade Agreement and his policies on incarceration. And that goes hand in hand with Joe Biden. The history of mass incarceration, you know, is peaked by, the Clinton administration. And that's something that folks don't want to talk about. The devastations in our communities, economic devastations, that prompted, job losses and the loss of homes for folks in our community, was prompted by the North American Free Trade Agreement, because it's a lot more, you know, beneficial to these corporations to pay someone in Tijuana or Juarez $3 a day than a good union job, in Pacoima, South Central, Yuma, where folks had benefits, where folks had the ability to care for their families, where folks had the ability to provide a good home for their children.
Definitely, definitely. So I mean, when we look at the kind of devastation of NAFTA, when we look at the 2008 housing crash, when we look at the amount of cases, I mean, the amount of just the sheer amount of cases that people are getting caught with COVID, um, we see a lot of communities impacted. We see a disproportionate amount of communities impacted. But speaking to you and your history with La Raza Unida, how do we account for just how just how badly people the Chicanos, the people of Mexican descent living in this country, whenever they cross or the borders cross them, or whatever, however we frame
Mhm.
that. When we see this population, how do we account for just how unevenly devastated we find our community in the midst of any crisis?
I mean, we account that by the structures that built this country, right? I mean, if we look at the devastations in our community right now based on COVID, it's because of structural racism, right? Our folks don't have the first ability to be able to go and seek medical care without, the impacts, these economic impacts that some folks don't have, right? And I consider myself, part of those folks that are lucky, to have a good union job that provides me, with healthcare for me and my children, but that is not the majority of our population. And structurally, our people do not benefit from that, right? So our people have to struggle with the lack of access to healthcare. Our folks are privileged to stay home and telecommute, right? So our folks have to go out and actually do the work. Right now they're being called essential workers and heroes of our communities, but they're not treated like heroes on a daily basis outside of this pandemic. So you have folks, having to go out to work, having to hustle, whichever way they can, to make sure that they are able to provide for their families. Then you have, housing issues, right? Most of our folks, because of the housing crisis, aren't living in single family homes, right? You're talking about in homes where you're sharing, a home with someone else because you're not able to provide that to your family by yourself anymore. And so we can go on, but those are some of the structural deficiencies that this country has and has built on the backs of our people. And that's why, I find it funny, that we're calling folks like, farm workers heroes, which they truly are. But what happened when they had the ability to pass, overtime laws and protections for folks and actually reflect that in their pay and their ability to provide homes and housing for their families? That's not reflected there, right? Access to education, access to homes, access to healthcare is not provided there. So how can we call our people heroes, in one breath, and in the other take away their rights and their livelihood?
So I don't think many people know. I mean, I myself, I've only, been recently. I mean, I kind of had an idea, but only been recently really made aware of just how many labor laws that farm workers have been historically exempt from, or I shouldn't say the farm
Mm-hmm.
workers, the owners, right, have
Mm-hmm.
historically been exempt from extending to their workers. Can you speak a little bit to that? I mean,
Correct.
since you mentioned
Yeah,
it.
I think that and I find it interesting, when we're talking about labor laws, how they're unequally applied to different folks, right? So yes, we have farm workers that are exempt from labor laws, like overtime, their breaks, access to water, access to bathroom, that are, California standards under OSHA, right? But these are not the only group of workers that are exempt from these laws, right? You have the same for in-home care providers, right? You have the same for folks that are, day laborers. So again, these are the pockets where most of our folks work. These are the pockets of jobs where most of our folks work. I mean, it wasn't until recently, and I would say maybe in the last 6 years, that as a union, we've been fighting UC, the biggest employer in California, the biggest employer of Black and Brown folks in California, because even UC itself was exempt from a lot of labor laws and codes that are applicable to other workers within the state of California or its municipalities. And so you would think, one of the largest employers, one of the most prestigious, education system in this country would, be held to a higher standard. But these disparities for Black and Brown workers consistently exist, right? So there are these loopholes that are made because the majority of its workforce looks like you and me.
So I want to kind of talk a little more broadly about this COVID crisis, because oftentimes, oh,
Sorry.
that's okay. Talk a little more broadly about it because oftentimes I don't get an opportunity to talk to people who have such long strong traditions in the movement. So I've been posing this question to several people who are
Mhm.
organizers, who are like revolutionary minded even. And it's interesting to see get the different answers people give. So why is it that a market system, generally speaking, a broad market system, can't address the needs of like a health pandemic?
Because it wasn't built on that. I mean, plain and simple, right? This market, right? This system, capitalism itself, wasn't built to support the issues of the masses, right? It just happens to be that the masses under this capitalist system here in the United States are Black and Brown, right? It doesn't mean that it lacks the ability, that it lacks the resources, right? That it even lacks the structure. None of those are true. It has the ability, it has the resources, it has a structure, but it is not part of its mechanism. And so I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think that I want people to understand that that's not what it's built to do, right? And I go back to the whole blender analogy, right? Capitalism is a blender that's made to churn and crush people, right? It is not a heater made to bring you warmth. It is not an air conditioning unit to help you cool down. And, it's not any of those things. It's built to crush people. And so just because we put a label on it that says for your comfort, right? Or a label on it that says, we value essential workers, the minute you put your hand in that blender, you're going to feel the effects of it. And that's what capitalism is built on. It's not built on it actually benefits from these disparities. And that's why you have Jeff Bezos, reaching and attaining the ability to become a trillionaire during a global pandemic, right? That's why you have Mark Zuckerberg, being able to attain, these great amounts of wealth from a global pandemic. And I know what the naysayers are going to say, right? Well, how can you talk about Mark Zuckerberg and you're on Facebook Live, right? I live under capitalism, right? And so I must use the tools of capitalism to work against it. I'm not going to pretend that if I go out in the hills and hide in the hills, and start, a 4-person commune out there with my family, that's going to change what happens in my community. And that's not, my family is my responsibility, but it's also my community, right? And I live under capitalism right now. Folks say, well, why don't you go live in a communist country? If I was born in a communist country, I would live in a communist country, but I was born here in the belly of the beast. And it is my human responsibility to make sure that I attack it, I challenge it, and I smash it in every way possible. And because I hear those arguments constantly, well, you're using Facebook. Yes, I have no choice to communicate to the masses. I could try to go to, Kinko's and print out, flyers and pass them out to every home or every person that I see, but that's not it. So I have to use its tools, right?
So you mentioned again the belly of the beast. So like this question of U.S. imperialism. I mean, it's quite remarkable that in this period of a global pandemic, right, when you
Mm-hmm.
see all these kinds of like shows of international solidarity, which are probably just between other countries, they're just they're probably just for show too. But you hear all that. But meanwhile, the United States of America, in this time period, has strengthened sanctions against Iran, has strengthened sanctions against Nicaragua, has threatened to send warships to Venezuela. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
the empire really never sleeps.
Absolutely, and look, this is all, I think this is all indicative of what we're talking about, how structurally, you know this country continues to build on exploiting situations where people are in crisis, where people are fragile, and exploiting these situations where its masses or its nation is preoccupied under another crisis. So of course they're going to take, the opportunity during a, worldwide pandemic to reach their tentacles in other places, right? I mean, they're going to do that. And I think it's absurd to think that, capitalism has a conscience, that capitalism, is humanitarian. We could be not capitalism, but this country could be, providing humanitarian aid to other countries instead of sanctions, because we do not lack the resources, right? We do not lack the resources, but we lack the ability to push this country to do right. And that's one of the things that we have to do. And that's why, pushing to organize our community has to be essential, because there is not one thing. And I have this argument with my kids all the time. They try to challenge me. I say, name one thing that's happened in this country that was changed through a voting booth. And there's not one thing. Anything that's changed in this country has been because people like you, myself, other Black and brown folks have gone out to the streets, have stomped the concrete, have made their voices heard, have rioted like they're rioting in Minneapolis last night for George Floyd. That's how actual change comes, through that rage, right? And I'm not, I'm not going to move away from that, because I think that that's the rage that we have to have. People say like, well, you can't be mad all the time. No, actually I can, because injustice creates these opportunities where we have people, 100,000 people dying, not because we lack the resources, but because this country lacks the compassion, the consciousness, and the human rights. 100,000 people have died in the richest, most powerful nation in the world, and you have tiny little countries like Vietnam with 0 deaths. You have tiny countries like Cuba with 8 deaths, right? But you have the richest country that does not lack its resources having its citizens die for no other reason than those folks were expendable. Those folks were absolutely expendable. You're not hearing that, someone in Jeff Bezos' family died. You never heard, Tom Hanks and his family had it recovered from it. Why? Because they do not lack the resources, right? Our communities lack those resources, and it's done on purpose.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I mean, you mentioned the riots, rebellions, what have you,
Mhm.
going on in Milwaukee with the murder of George Floyd. It's very interesting though. I mean, like that they were greeted. The protest was greeted with tear gas and
Mhm.
with that. So even in the midst of this pandemic, which is a respiratory pandemic, actually, a
Mhm.
pandemic with our lungs and our ability to breathe. Um, the oppression of the state, it does not cease.
We are expendable to them. And every interaction that we have with the state demonstrates how expendable we are, right? We're expendable because we are the workforce. We are expendable because we are their fodder, for war. We are expendable because the minute that we defend ourselves, they will challenge us and they will greet us with this violent clashes. Because why? Because they decide whether we live or die. And the state has that right, and people do not see that. The state can decide whether, in an interaction between the police and yourself, they have the right to decide whether you live or die. And that is definitely based on the color of your skin. The darker you are, right? Whether you're Raza, whether you're Black, whether you're brown, the darker you are, the chances of you dying in this country become more incremental because they make us expendable. They make us expendable. And it's up to us, folks, that are on the lighter spectrum of things to be able to use our voices and our bodies to protect our communities, whether they're brown or they're Black. It is our responsibility, and I think that for me, one of the most important things as a brown mom, as a Chicana, is that I have to be the accomplice to my Black community, to our Black community. We have to be accomplices, not allies, not transactional relationships, but really accomplices. And in these situations, really use the privilege that some of us have being lighter as forms of barriers for other folks to protect them, barriers to use our bodies in order to make sure that other folks have the right to be heard, and also creating spaces for those conversations to happen in our communities.
So, but speaking of tear gas, though, I mean, this marks the 50th year of the Chicano moratorium.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Ruben Salazar killed with gas canister to the head. I know that you were kind of instrumental in organizing these passes. In fact, we met at the 40th, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about the importance and legacy of the Chicano moratorium and celebration?
I think the importance is that the things that we were fighting for in 1970 still resonate right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? We want to stop being the fodder for this country. We're sending our children, Black and brown children around the world, to kill other Black and brown folks for resources that we ourselves will never benefit from, and that are actually completely in contradiction with what we should be doing. In 1970, we were still, fighting the highest dropout rate amongst our community, amongst Chicanos. And emphasis that when I say Chicanos, I'm not just saying folks born here. I'm not saying just folks of Mexican descent. I'm saying Chicanos, that I'm saying folks that are brown and have that same experience of inner cities struggles like a lot of us do, right? That those folks are still amongst the highest suffering from dropout rates, no different than 50 years ago. that we're still saying that we have the right to be treated as humans and have access to free healthcare, that we still have the right to have livable income for our families, right? That we still have the right to housing. All those struggles still continue today, still continue today. Do some people feel like we've done nothing in 50 years? Yeah, some people feel like that. Do some people think that we've, have a lot of things that we've achieved, in 50 years because we have J-Lo? Sure, people feel like that too. But what I think that these 50 years are a reminder is that we have to constantly be organizing in our communities, constantly organizing in our communities, because our communities are going to continue to be constantly attacked. And so it's up to us to continue to bring our communities together. It's up to us to be able to make sure that we highlight the issues in the communities and that we organize, because I truly believe that nothing is going to happen in our communities if we do not decide to actually organize and actually be part of organizations with, some theory and actual praxis. Because I think that that's what a lot of the things that we've seen in the last decades happen. We have folks that are well intended, saying, well, this is what I believe, but at no time, are they actually organizing in the community. They're not organizing themselves. They're not, developing any ideologies or even reading about different ideologies to be able to understand the world at large.
So as somebody that grew up in the movement, can you talk a little bit about the importance of like at whatever age you're at, wherever you find yourself, if you want to go out and make change in the world, the importance of investing in your own political education? And it isn't necessarily even going to school. I mean, just like study groups and just like reading literature and just taking in ideas. Can you speak to just how important revolutionary theory is towards revolutionary practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that folks often feel either bogged down or bombarded with picking up picking up books, right? I think that overwhelmed sometimes or out of their comfort. And I think that one of the things that I feel is more important is that as people of color, we have to try, right? We have to try and start understanding these theories and ideologies like capitalism, socialism, communism, imperialism, colonialism, and understanding its roots, its structure, its constructs, and really being able to challenge yourself and, you know, read. I hear it a lot in different circles. Well, I don't read Karl Marx because he was white. Well, you know what? Ideas aren't only, for a certain group of people. Ideas are open for everybody. And so, yes, Karl Marx wrote it, and he was the person that, you know, decided to take the time to write it. But that doesn't mean that, they're mutually exclusive to him as a white Jewish man, or a Russian. They're not just exclusive to him, they're open to all of us. And we have to stop, creating these barriers for us and really study, right? Have the ability to study. And I always tell folks, if you find something difficult, start in one place, reread that page 50 times if you have to, but it's the practice, right? It's the practice. And it's something that, folks take for granted, and folks really think that we can, you know, change the world without really understanding the roots of all these structures. And I think that that's unfair.
Yeah, it won't work, right? I mean,
It won't, it won't.
it won't work. I mean, whether it's
Yeah.
fair or not fair, it's not. We're
Yeah.
not going to be able to do
I
it.
mean, yeah, I mean, I like to make a lot of analogies, right? My my dad was a teacher, right? So I always tell folks, saying that you don't read or that you don't want to read or these ideas are mutually exclusive or because they're a white man, you don't want to read them is like saying, I want to build a house, but I don't want to talk to an architect. I don't want to refer to an architect book. I'm just going to build the house, you know? So what's your starting point and what's your ending point? And so you have to have a starting point and you have to have an ending point. And yeah, do sometimes those starting points include other people outside your circle? Yeah, does the trajectory sometimes include learning stuff about other things that you may not put to use all the time? Sure, it does. But you have to be able to be willing to be open to those ideas and take them in so that you are able to build a sound house with a foundation. And that's what we're trying to build for our people. We're trying to build a sound foundation. And in order to be able to build a sound foundation, I can't just say I'm anti-capitalist and not know what capitalism is and has done historically, what are its constructs and how it perpetuates itself. I have to be able to challenge that, right? So that I can at least know this is why I hate capitalism, because it exploits the labor of folks. It exploits people's bodies. It exploits, every aspect of our life.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I kind of I've posed this question to a few people as well, and it's always interesting to get the it's an obvious it's got an obvious answer, but I'm always interested in the different ways in which people answer it. So why is it that Cuba has in the middle of a global health pandemic is able to send doctors around the world, whereas in the United States of America we have a president encouraging people to drink bleach?
I mean, I think that Cuba, um, in all its limitations, has invested in its people, right? And so Cuba was not built to exploit the labor of folks. Cuba was built to raise up and actually even out folks' labor and contributions. I was there in 2000, and in a casual conversation, I was talking to someone who was responsible for cleaning the area's park. And I was just having a casual conversation with this woman, and she was saying that she was finishing up, and she was waiting for her boyfriend to get there to meet her because they were going to leave. And then, just out of curiosity, I asked her, what her boyfriend did. And he was a physicist, and it struck me, right? And I didn't want to tell her anything to feel bad, right? But we live under capitalism where we see that as an anomaly, right? That this person who is a gardener, a groundskeeper at a local park, you know, is in a relationship with a physicist, right? And even though that class systems should be completely smashed, you as a person who has been indoctrinated by this system, you know, found, it difficult to process that idea at that time, and it was just something that I noticed amongst myself. I was like, wow, damn. And why is that? It's because Cuba, right? You can be a doctor, you can be a groundskeeper, you can be a trash person, and you are a valuable person, citizen of your country. Your value is not determined by your labor or your wage or your status. And I think that that's one of the things that Cuba has done. And it's one of the beautiful things that I've seen that Cuba has done, is that it's been able to really educate hundreds of doctors for our communities throughout the world. So beautiful Black and brown doctors have been able to receive a free education in Cuba. And I think that that's one of the main reasons that Cuba is so successful, that it's able to send out its doctors worldwide. And it puts this country to shame. And it puts this country to shame because it's really been able to be an example of what it is to be in solidarity with other communities. I mean, Cuba has offered that same help here to the United States after Katrina. Cuba has offered, of course, the United States has rejected it, but Cuba has offered that same aid as well, and it's something that we have to respect.
Yeah. So we're approaching the hour. So is there are there any final words of inspiration, or what we should be doing in this moment, like how we should be organizing? What should people do if they want to go out there and change the world? What's step one? Like I'm sitting here, I'm mad, but I don't know what to do. What should I do?
I think that the first thing that we have to do is start with ourselves, right? And our immediate circles. And I think that sometimes that's what people fail or lack to do. right? I can't challenge my family. I can't challenge the way my family has been. It's too difficult, and I think that that's one of the things that we first have to do is that we have to be able to raise up ourselves and the consciousness of the people around us. And will it be difficult? Absolutely. Our family members indoctrinated just as much as anybody else? Absolutely. But that's our responsibility. And our responsibility is to be able to raise the consciousness of ourselves, our families, and then start with our communities through organizations, and that's the only way that, that really has to be done. As a parent, I want to say that it's our responsibility to do that with our children. I think one of the things that I always applaud my parents of doing is that in the face of this organizing, a lot of their peers did not include their children in the organizing process. I remember being at meetings and knowing that my peers were allowed to be outside of the meeting room, running around, playing, enjoying their time, and maybe at the time I found it very difficult that I was told, you have to stay in here and at least listen. You can draw, you can play, but you have to at least listen. And I think that that's one of the things that, as a parent, especially during these times, we have to have our kids start listening to these ideas, being involved and shared in these circles. Will it be ideas that, sometimes are a little difficult to explain? Yes. But these are things that they're going to face as they get older. And if we want to build stronger people, we have to be able to introduce them to these ideas, because our children are going to face these disparities. Our children are going to face racism. Our children are going to face, patriarchy. Our children are going to face colonialism. And if we don't teach them now, you know, then we're actually doing a disservice to our children. And so I think as a parent, my number one thing is that focusing on our families and focusing on our children to be able to build stronger, more compassionate human beings.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been very illuminating, and I hope to see and organize and fight the good fight
Mhm.
alongside you very soon.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it too, and I hope everyone is safe.
So
Thank you.
thank you so much.